Welcome to our next video, which will provide some background information about the book of Joshua. Joshua moves God's story from the creation of a distinct people called to bless the world to then God fulfilling his plan through his people. This is part of a Bible reading plan with Anthem Church, and today's video is from a discussion I led a few years ago, and I edited to provide you with the essential content to help you better understand what is going on in these significant chapters. So let's get started.
And so with the book of Joshua, we start a new and major section of the Old Testament. And so we call it the Old Testament. That's how the Christians divide the Bible between the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is really the Hebrew scriptures, and it's divided into three sections. This is how it was divided for the Jews, which is the scriptures that Jesus referenced in the New Testament. It's the Torah that we just looked at, the first 5 books, the prophets, and then the writings. And so we'll talk about the writings next time, but the prophets is the next section. And so after we completed the Torah with Deuteronomy, we began a new section with Joshua called the prophets' history. It's really the story, not their message. Their message is like, you think of like Isaiah, Jeremiah, the minor prophets. That's a message. We're going to look at the prophets' history, which starts with Joshua. We go into Judges, and then you got 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings. And so this section continues God's story with the descendants of Abraham, but it moves from a creation of a distinct people called to bless the world. That's the Torah. So the Torah is all about this creation of a distinct people to bless the world. Now it's God fulfilling his plan through the people of Israel. That's the prophet's history. And so in the prophet's history, we learn that God continues to be faithful, but Israel continues to remain faithless. That's why the Bible's so long, as they just don't get it. We don't get it. And even in the land they were given, they repeatedly do not listen to God. And so as promised, Israel will be exiled, disciplined by God in hopes that they turn back to him. And so from the start of Joshua, the reader continues to look for the wounded victor and the prophet like Moses. But all of Israel's leaders fall short. We're going to look at the next key leader, who is David. It's coming up in a couple months. But while God continues to work through this rebellious people that we're going to see, especially in the book of Judges next, obedience to the law seems impossible. It's really demonstrating the need for God to transform the hearts of his people, which Moses promised in Deuteronomy, with the promise of an eternal kingdom, which we're going to look at with David. The reader is left hopeful for a future blessing and now looks for God to fulfill that promise by a future messianic king. And so that's what David's going to really introduce into the story. Let's look at Joshua. I just want to introduce Joshua, and then we'll take a moment to really talk through this together. But let me continue. So I want to look at the places, the people, and the timeline. So when you think about a story, the place, the people, the characters, their development, and the timeline is really what shapes things. And so if you look from left to right, you can see on this photo, and I know it's kind of small, but you can see how the Israelites are moving from Moab into the promised land, and they have the different routes that they take. They have a covenant renewal that we read about in the beginning, the story of the Gibeonites, and then you see them pursuing the Canaanites and their northern campaign. And so what that does is by Joshua 12 to 13, in the pink in the middle map, that's the area of the promised land that they take possession of. So you'll notice they take possession for most of it, but not all of it. And yet God, he authorized them to take possession of it, which is what Joshua describes as he's dividing the land in chapter 13 to 22. And so the tribal divisions is on the far right. That's what the promised land was given to Israel. And you can see even it references the different tribes where they're located. And then you can also see the different relatives of the Israelites that we talked about last time, the Ammonites, the Moabites, and the Edomites. But that just gives you kind of a space to understand what this looks like and helps us kind of get a picture of what's going on. And so let's look at the people next. There's really God against Canaan. You have Israel, and then you have Joshua. Those are kind of the main people. And so this is a story of Israel battling and ultimately defeating the Canaanites for two reasons. One, so that they dwell in the land God promised Abraham's family. So that's their purpose. And then from God's perspective, we also see that God fulfills his commitment to punish the Canaanites for their sin. And so I know Joshua is going to be a really hard read in terms of just seeing the violence that is occurring. And so I know that can be tough, but let's look at Canaan's judgment. Remember, that was predicted in Genesis 15:6. And so way back when there's the covenant being made between God and Abraham, it's mentioned about Canaan's judgment. And so the Canaanites were introduced even before that in chapter 9 and 10 with Noah. They're descendants of Ham, and Ham was really highlighted for his sin. It's not a great start. And so from that starting point, we read how the Canaanites became more and more morally corrupt as a society. So that's what's important to understand. We're not talking about an individual, we're talking about a society. And so, for example, one of those things that we read about is that they practice child sacrifices. So think about that. When we're talking about the Canaanites, that should be our understanding. They pursued magic. You read that there's a lot of sexual perversion. All of this can be read in Leviticus 18 and Deuteronomy 18. And so because of that, in Deuteronomy 9:4-5, Moses wrote, "It is because of the wickedness of these nations that Yahweh is driving them out before you." So this is really God's punishment upon them. And it's clear that it's a punishment for them rejecting God's way. It's for their sin. And so think of it this way. After waiting for 400 years from when this was introduced in Genesis 15 to this point, God's given them plenty of time, warning them to turn from their sin. But God now punishes them for their wrongdoing. And so Israel's role in Joshua is primarily depicted as God's instrument of punishment. His command was for the Israelites, and this is a tough one, but to completely destroy them. The Hittites, Amorites, Canaanites, Perizzites, Hivites, and Jebusites. So those are the different nations in Canaan. Often it's kind of summarized as the Canaanites. But this destruction is to be complete because their sin is complete. The fulfillment of their sin is at hand. And so it's going to be a complete judgment. It's how that works. And so God, Israel and their success is in part due to the Canaanites' failure. But more than that, this story is really about God's glory, how he's wanting his way to be revealed in the world. They're not revealing it. And so God's keeping his promise to the Jews, and he's faithful to them. And so that's where this is both, you see how it's a fulfillment of the promise, but it's also a fulfillment of the punishment. It's blessing and cursing, which is what we heard of in Genesis 12 with Abraham. And so that's looking at the characters. We'll talk more about just kind of the implications of this with, how does God handle war for a Christian, and what about genocide? I know those are really, especially for young people that are kind of reading the Bible for the first time, it's a hard one. But let's look at the timeline. And so it's broken up into 4 parts. You see the leadership of the new Moses, which is Joshua in the first 5 chapters. Then you see the battle in chapters 6-12, dividing the land in 13-22, and then closing remarks. And so this is what is a way to understand the book of Joshua as we're reading it. So in the first part, Joshua is appointed really as the new Moses. And yet at the end of his life, he dies because of sin, the sin problem. So he's not the Moses that's promised in Deuteronomy, but he is appointed as a replacement to Moses. He calls the people to obey. He sent spies in the land, just like Moses did. But unlike the last time with Moses, the people trust God to enter the land. And so Joshua led them across the Jordan onto dry ground. And before the first battle, Joshua renewed their covenant with God. It's so important to believe that God meets with them. And he did through this angelic warrior. who was not for Joshua or his enemies. We're going to look at that a bit more because that's a really key moment, because that's going to say that the upcoming battles were God's battle. And so Israel is really spectators in God's plan. You see that best in Jericho. That was not a good military strategy. It really shows how Israel is just watching what God does. But really, this first part is to show how they're prepared, and they're prepared to enter the land and take possession of it. And so the second is God's battle. And so the first two battles are contrasting portraits of God's faithfulness versus Israel's failure. So against Jericho, that's the portrait of God's faithfulness. God's people only need to play trumpets to win the battle, which is crazy. God delivers his people, and Israel only needs to wait and trust God. Now, the next battle against Ai, in contrast, the Israelites are totally defeated because of Achan's sin. And so if Israel is to inherit the land, then they need to obey and trust in God's commands, because God fights for Israel only if his people are obedient to their covenant. So it's a relationship. And then just in closing, the third and the fourth parts, the third part's fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham. That's when Joshua divides up the land. Now, they haven't possessed all of it, but that's how they divide it up. And so God is faithful to his promise, and it's stated in Joshua 21:43, the Lord gave to Israel all the land he promised to his forefathers. So God gave it to them. And so now they just needed to trust that and take it, take what God has given to them. Receive it is probably a better word. But finally, in the last part, the closing remarks, Joshua's reminding Israel of God's generosity. He's calling them to turn from the Canaanite gods because they still have some work to do. And so he wants them to be faithful to God's covenant, which results in blessing. And so when we think about kind of the storyline, the general plot, what started in Genesis is fulfilled by Joshua. That's really what's going on. You see that in Joshua 21:43 through 45. Let me read that really quick. So 21:43 through 45. Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their forefathers, and they took possession of it, and they settled there. And the Lord gave them rest on every side, just as it had been sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. And so that's a significant conclusion. And God's people, so then they've inherited a place for them. They have a place to become God's blessing to all the nations that's promised to Abraham in Genesis 12 and prophesied in Genesis 15. So they have a place. Yet this is only the beginning for Israel as they enter God's rest. Notice it's the beginning. They enter God's rest because they have not yet taken full possession of all that God has promised. Furthermore, Joshua knows that even what they did possess through his leadership had not been guaranteed to them if they rebel and reject God's way, his law. And so Joshua understands that they need to be faithful and they need to follow God's word. And so Israel is only as strong as their commitment to remain faithful to the covenant, which Moses had emphasized in his final speech in Deuteronomy. We read that. And then which Joshua has done a good job in leading God's people to do this to this point in the story. So Joshua's really led his people well in the book of Joshua. Yet you see that Joshua closes the book by calling on the next generation to finish what they started. God had given them the right to everything he had promised. You see that in Joshua 1:4. And so they're authorized to take full possession of the entire land as soon as they needed it and as soon as they called on the Lord. So the story ends with a question of whether the next generation will finish what Joshua started by remaining faithful to God, which is especially in question without a new leader. There's no leader identified to follow Joshua. And yet the real message here is simple. God is faithful to his promise. God is faithful to his promise. The long journey through the wilderness for God's people is over. They entered the land. They subdued the enemies. They found rest on every side. And just as this new generation led by Joshua was called to renew their commitment to God before entering the land, which is what they do at the end, now the next generation is, Joshua, they renewed their covenant at the beginning of Joshua. Now at the end of Joshua, the next generation is also called to follow in their footsteps by placing their full trust in God's powerful presence to provide what he promised. And they're going to step out in faith to do it, to take possession of the entire land given to them. So there's more work to do. There's more battles ahead of them, but the next generation can look to God, who is faithful to his promise. Now, I want to close before we talk. I want to look at really two key moments. We mentioned one of them, which is really in that kind of preparation section, the first 5 chapters. And so Joshua 5, you read this amazing story where he's with this angelic warrior. I want to pull it up here with as we're looking at this together. Okay, so now first, as if all the previous preparatory events were not sufficient enough to express God's intention to give Joshua the land, this is kind of the final revelatory meeting that he has with God. And so think of Joshua from his perspective. Moses has been this incredible leader. He's following in his footsteps. Will God do for Joshua, with Joshua, like he did for Moses? Those are the questions that are being asked. And so Joshua has already been called to replace Moses in a Moses-like call in chapter 1. He was affirmed by their crossing of the sea into the promised land in chapter 3. These are all kind of retelling the story through the lens that Joshua is the new Moses. And then you have this renewed covenant of chapter 5. And so now after all that, this unique story where the leader of God's armies meets with the head of Yahweh's army, an encounter that the text says requires Joshua to remove his sandals due to it occurring on holy ground. This is in chapter 5, verse 15. What does that remind us of? Well, that's an unmistakable reference to Exodus 3, 1 through 6, which started everything for Moses. And so God is truly with Joshua as he was with Moses. And so having led according to God's will, Joshua here received God's full approval and affirmation for his obedience to God. So that's really important to see that from the writer's perspective, this is really affirming the next generation, that it's not about Moses, it's about God and how he works with his people. And so that's a big step in the story, is moving from Moses, who's been this huge figure, to now Joshua. Now, the second thing is an interesting part. Joshua asks if the angel is on the Israelites' side or the enemies. And so with these words, Joshua reveals that his understanding of the battle ahead is kind of seen like this, that God is pro-Israel and God is anti-Canaanite. And so the angel quickly corrects him by saying, no, I'm the captain of the Lord's army. And the point is clear. God is going to bring his judgment on human evil because God fights for what is good and he's against what is evil. We've seen that since Genesis and Exodus. And so this is not about Israel versus Canaan. The real question is whether Israel is on God's side. And what this means for Joshua is Israel is not above God's law. They will be held accountable to the same standard God has for Canaan and really for the whole world. And so as with Canaan, God will not look the other way. No, God does not play favorites. And Joshua knows this because Moses warned the Israelites that they will face the same consequences if they follow in the Canaanites' footsteps. You can read that in Deuteronomy 28, 25 through 68. And so this is all to say, this angelic warrior is a personal reminder for Joshua to focus on faithfulness. Focus on faithfulness to God, and not to worry as much about the future battles. Remember, God fights for Israel when his people are faithful, they're obedient to their covenant with God. And so that's where this is really showing that this is bigger than Israel. This is God, and he's fulfilling his promise, and he's faithful. And so that's Joshua 5. And then let's look, then after that, they go fight. You see the contrasting battles of when they're faithful, when they're not faithful, they divide the land. And then there's these closing remarks. And so that's where we're gonna jump ahead to Joshua 23. You know, Israel under Joshua stands as a memorial to obedience. You see that in Joshua 24:31. I want to just read that here. Joshua 24:31. So at the end it said, Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua. So this is a good story. And it says, all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua and had known all the works that the Lord did for Israel. So they were faithful. They did what they said they would do. And so because of their commitment to Yahweh, Joshua is able to say at the end of his life that no one was able to withstand them because the Lord God fought for them just as he had promised. And that's in Joshua 23, 9-10. Let me read that really briefly here. It says, for the Lord has driven out before you great and strong nations. And as for you, no man has been able to stand before you to this day. One man of you puts to fight 1,000, since it is the Lord your God who fights for you, just as he promised. And so this is God's battle. This is God's work. And he did it. And yet, as successful as Joshua was to model obedience to the next generation, there is no leader appointed to continue the work as Moses had accomplished in calling God to appoint his replacement with Joshua before he died. So you remember that Moses was really committed to making sure that God appointed the next leader. And so this leadership vacancy that we see at the end of Joshua is both an opportunity, but more importantly, a reminder for the reader that success is not only in individuals living an obedient moral life, but in successfully passing the baton to the next generation of leadership, helping others, helping them to follow God so that God's work continues with God's people, because the work continues. And it's to see this work continue for generations to come. And so as we conclude Joshua, it really ends with this question of whether they will remain faithful to God, which is especially in question without a new leader identified. Without leadership, what will happen to God's people? That's how Joshua closes. So I want to